Hello and welcome to Think Watercolour. One of the questions I get asked most often is whether to wet your paper before painting or should you paint on dry paper. Well, it all depends on what you want to achieve. Both methods are absolutely fine, but each has advantages and disadvantages. There are many wonderful watercolour artists who always wet their paper first. Some even wet both sides. There are also many wonderful artists who never wet the paper first. There's no right or wrong, it just boils down to whatever works for you. Today I'm going to paint from this reference photo of some clouds, and on the left I'm going to wet the whole paper first, and on the right I'm going to paint the same image on dry paper and try and show you the difference between the two methods. So I'm just going to use a large flat brush. This is 3/4 inch flat brush, just to wet the paper on the left. I've got a pencil mark there, it doesn't matter. It's just a demonstration piece, so let's get the paper nice and wet. Make sure I give it a good soaking. Okay, I'm just going to let that soak into the paper for a minute, and while that's soaking in, I'm going to mix up some colour. I just want to say the methods I'm going to demonstrate are just a good guide. Discovering what works for you is all part of the challenge and fun of painting in watercolours. So let's mix up some colour. I'm going to start with some cobalt blue. Obviously for the blue sky. And I'm going to mix up some ultramarine and burnt sienna to create a nice grey. And the thing when you're painting wet into wet paper is always mix your colours darker, because the wetness of the paper is going to dissipate the colour and reduce its strength. So always bear that in mind when you're painting wet in wet. You have to go even darker than you would normally. And as I always say, if the colour looks right on your palette, make it a little bit darker, because it will dry lighter. Right, let's start with the sky. When you're painting wet in wet, you have less control over keeping areas of the paper white. So you have to be a little bit careful. So there's a white cloud here, and then the blue sky drops down to a point there. Just using a number 12 Skoda Perla for this. As you can see in the palette, that looks quite dark, but once you put it on the paper, because the paper is very wet, straight away you're getting a much lighter colour. So as I said before, always bear that in mind when you're painting wet into wet. I'm not going to try and slavishly copy this reference photo. It's just a guide so that I can try and replicate it in both paintings, just to demonstrate different ways you can paint. Just going to drop in some slightly darker values of the blue. This will dissolve and become less. I'll just maybe add a little bit of grey into that, just to darken it a little bit. Sort of a patchy, cloudy blue sky. adding more pigment at the bottom here. Just letting it blend. Create these nice cloud effects. Maybe a bit of a dark cloud in there. All the while it's wet, you can add more and more. But once the paper starts to dry, if you're going to add more colour, have as little water in your brush as possible, because otherwise you're going to get cauliflowers and runbacks and that sort of thing. So always be aware of that. It's going to darken this a little bit more. I'd like it to be much darker at the base, but we shall see. When it's dry, you can always come back and add more. It's that's the part of the fun of watercolour. I'm painting with the board flat here rather than on a slope. If you have your board on a slope, the gravity is going to pull your pigments towards the bottom of your page, so always bear that in mind. There's nothing wrong with painting on a slope, but I find if I'm painting a scene like this with clouds, wet in wet, I find it easier to have the board flat. You have a little bit more control over where the paint runs, and it will still puddle in a few places because the paper's cockling because it's so wet. And talking about paper, I would always advocate using a really good weight of paper and quality paper when you're painting wet in wet, because the paper takes a fair bit of hammer with all the water you're throwing at it. This is Saunders Waterford 300 gram rough paper. It's a paper I use most of the time these days, but there are others on the market, Arches or Arches, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's French, so Arches is the correct way, I think. Make a very similar paper, and it's just as good to paint with. I use that sometimes. And there's a newish paper on the market. I think it came out a couple of years ago and became widely available. It's by Bao Hong, Chinese company, and their rough paper is really rough, but it's a lovely texture if you want to do textured paintings. But it also takes a hell of a lot of water, so that would be a good one to use for this sort of painting. While this is still wet, I'm just going to get a piece of kitchen towel, and if you just scrunch it up so you've got a little tip there, you can lift out some of the water just to create a brighter patch in these clouds as per the reference. By lifting out and dabbing the paper, you are effectively stopping the spread, so you can, it's a good way of manipulating things. Just going to add a little bit more pigment on this bottom area. Just want that to be a little bit darker. It's going to, again, clean kitchen towel, just lift out a little bit up here. Just to, the trick is not to go over the same area twice with the same piece of towel. Use a cleaner piece, and that's about done. So that's wet in wet. Wet paper, plenty of pigment. Mixture paints darker because they will dry much lighter. This is going to dry much lighter than it is now, and I would go back and darken some areas once it's dry. But for the purposes of the demonstration, that's how you do it wet in wet. And I'm just going to let that dry a little bit, and then I'm going to paint the same paint from the same reference on the right hand side, as I said before, using dry paper. Okay, so I'm just going to mix up some more of the cobalt blue for the blue sky. And talking of colours, when you're painting wet in wet like this and you're lifting out, just be careful which colours you use. Try not to use staining colours because they're pretty much impossible to get out and leave a completely white area. Ultramarine and cobalt blue are transparent non-staining colours, as is burnt sienna, so they work quite well for this. But if you use the wrong blue, say phthalo blue for example, I think that's a staining blue. You can find out from the manufacturers which ones are staining, but if you just try and avoid the staining ones if you're going to do any lifting out with a paper towel, because you will not get back to the whiteness of the paper. You see here we're still retaining some of the white of the paper. Anyway, let's get on with the working on the dry. I need more paint for this because I'm working on dry paper and it will soak in very quickly. So let's start with the blue sky. So I'll try and copy this rather than the reference, so that you can see a good comparison, but let's see how we go. So I've got a cloud there. What I'm doing here, I'm making sure I paint around the areas that I want to leave completely white. Plenty of water on the brush. Scumbling a bit. I don't normally scumble this much, but I'm trying to rush this a little bit just to get the demonstration done fairly quickly for you. Okay, so what I'm going to do with some clean water is just soften the edges up here. And you can see when you're painting on dry paper, it's much easier to retain the whiteness of the paper. So just a damp brush, just softening edges. I'm just going to lift out a little bit there. That's fine. Soften this edge down here. Same here. Just a damp brush, not too much water. Just darken a few areas up here, I think, while it's still wet. Maybe add a little bit of that grey. Trick is not to let it dry too quickly because you will end up with hard edges. So just mix up a little bit more of the grey and come in here. Yeah, soften that in. Just using clean water just to soften edges. And I'm going to mix up a little bit more of the grey down here and just darken it. You can see with it being on dry paper, the tonal value holds well when you go in dark, whereas the wet paper has kind of dissolved the pigment, so turning out much lighter. Talking of paper, some artists prefer to tape their paper down, and others like to stretch the paper before they paint. I used to stretch paper when I first started many years ago, but after a few years I found it kind of tedious doing it, and also I felt that it put pressure on not to waste a piece of paper that you've stretched. So I stopped doing it and started using heavier paper. I was using lighter paper in those days. Started using heavier paper and found that just taping it down was fine. And that's all I've got here. It's just taped down with masking tape, and I find it works fine. So just try both ways, see what you think. As I say, I just find stretching the paper just adds more work to what you're trying to achieve, and I'm just using some clean water just to soften that. A bit more pigment here while it's still wet. I'll just get a clean piece of towel and just soften these clouds a little bit, lift out. Same technique as before. Maybe I can add some water there and do that. Okay. Just moving the pigment around a little bit while it's still wet. The thing when you're painting the same thing twice, you're never going to get it exactly the same. It's impossible. I just wanted to demonstrate the two ways that you can paint. So I'm going to let those dry and then come back, and then you can see them side by side dry. Okay, well that's all dry now, and you can see side by side there's not a lot of difference. So you really don't have to paint wet in wet. It's up to you. Try both methods, especially if you're a beginner. Have a go at trying different ideas and see what effects you get. You get a slightly different effect with when you're painting on dry. You have a little bit more control over where the whites are and how white they stay. Having said that, with lifting out, you can see if you're careful with how you put paint to paper, you can still retain some good whites for the clouds. Give it a try and see what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you gain something from this. I try and do these demonstrations to show people or answer people's questions. There is no right way to paint, and there are no real rules. It's good practice, like not painting wet into damp, otherwise you're going to get runbacks and cauliflowers. But other than that, it's just a question of really learning your palette and see which colours are staining and which colours aren't. Either go on the manufacturer's website or just try it on some spare piece of paper and see which ones you can lift and which ones you can't, and you get to know your palette. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful. I always try and answer people's questions when they post a comment, and I hope this has given you a little bit of an insight that really you can paint wet in wet or wet on dry. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day. With clouds, you can get the same sort of effect quite easily with both methods. With other things, you might find a little bit more difficulty. So just try painting in different styles and see how you get on. If you enjoyed this video, do give it a like. It really helps with YouTube, and do subscribe if you're not a subscriber, and hit the notification bell. I'll try and post once a week when I can. And thanks again for watching.